Often if you talk to someone about something, they will immediately reference it back to themselves and see how it relates to their life and their experiences. Is that the same kind of self-reference as what we're talking about here? That or are there different kinds of types of self-reference?
Well, I mean, I suppose in some sense there are different types of self-reference, in as much as, in a way, all of us are constantly taking in data from experience, and all we have to work with to understand it is, in many ways, a comparison to what we've already acquired. So if we looked at that as a process of self-reference, then I would say that that's a natural process of self-reference. Usually, though, the notion of self-reference is actually much more tied to what is called Ahamkara. Ahamkara is a Sanskrit word, and it represents that tendency to see and act in the world with a preoccupation with your individuality as a coloring to the perception. It doesn't mean that you're blatant about it. It doesn't mean that you are constantly saying to people, using the word I this, I that. That's a very blatant aspect of Ahamkara. But it can be very hidden and yet self-referencing in that way. The key to understand here is that the soul, the higher part of us, which is a self as well, it's a self with a capital S. That self does not need to attend to itself in the sense that it doesn't need to in any way affirm itself. It's simply it's much more decentralized rather than centralized. So in the end, Ahamkara vanishes by the time you reach full enlightenment. But that doesn't mean that you suddenly have no identity either. It simply means that individuality will always be present, but a preoccupation with it, a absorption in it, a tendency to subtly reference it, all of that vanishes. To use a metaphor and talk about it in terms of a master versus a human being, let me use an analogy as opposed to a metaphor. Got it. Self-reference is to a master what animal instinct is to a human being. Self-reference, or the tendency of focus on individuality, is to a master what animal instinct is to a human being. Meaning, for a human being, we've risen above the animal kingdom, but the instinctual patterns are still very clearly present in us, and we don't really have to look too far to find them. They're below the threshold of preoccupation and attention, perhaps, but they're clearly there. And we can access it at will, if we like. And the same is true with a master. A master has no interest in automatically being focused on his or her individuality. That is much more below the surface of consciousness or focus, but it can be accessed at any time in order, as like a tool in a toolbox, if that sense of individuality can be useful as a means of making a service contribution.